Here in part 4, let's talk about the Carboniferous. The plants developed cellulose and lignin to give them structure, allowing them to become tall. As they became tall, in this evolution here, what we see is that lignin allowed these structures to elongate above the surface, far larger than we saw in mosses, liverworts, and so forth. This is Cooksonia. This is a cartoon drawing of what we think Cooksonia looked like. And so the expansion with the development of lignin, we think took place about 425 or so million years ago. Associated with this lignification was also the development of a vascular system. And the purpose of the vascular system is to move water and nutrients from the soil surface on up to these higher photosynthetic tissues. So now if we begin to look at the evolution of land plants, we find that as we move beyond the hornworts and get into what are called the lycophytes, the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms, that at about this time here, about 400 million years ago, we began to see vascular plants. These vascular plants were associated with lignin to provide structure, of vascular tissue to move nutrients around, and roots to acquire nutrients and water from the soil, but also to provide a stabilizing feature. So the evolutionary sequence is the development of the sporophyte, then the development of the cuticle and air pores, followed then by the development of stomata, and then followed by the development of structures for height, a vascular system, lignification, and roots. Following that, we'll see that the next evolutionary feature was the development of a megaphyll, which is a multivein leaf. So that when we have this initial vascular structure, what we had were microphylls. And microphylls have a single vein for a leaf. So you have a very narrow leaf versus the leaves that we typically see today, which are megaphylls. So a good contrast here might be, what does a maple leaf look like versus what does a pine needle or horsetail leaf look like? So with the rise of vascular plants, 425 million years ago, the evolution of lignin creating height, we entered a very new period. Photosynthesis was much more extensive at that time. And for about 200 million years ago, for 200 million years, giant lycophytes, very primitive vascular plants, horsetails, and some ferns began to dominate the land surface, and they outcompeted bryophytes. So bryophytes had a much more limited distribution, still close to water, and requiring the presence of water because they didn't have a vascular tissue. So here is a fossil drawing, I'll try to show this in class, of lepidodendron in the Carboniferous period. It had a microphyll leaf, and it's often called scale tree because when you look at it, this is what you see in terms of the fossils that are preserved. So these would have been leaves that broke off. So this would be the remnant of a microphyll leaf. Here you see the kind of root structure that they're known to have had. These trees got to be about 30 meters tall. The Carboniferous period is associated with lycophytes. It's also associated with the period in which most of the carbon that's been sequestered on Earth was formed. So for a brief period of less than 100 million years, most of the carbon on our planet was produced, and it was produced by lycophytes. Lycophytes were the dominant tree form in those days. It's also the time when we find giant dragonflies. So what was going on in those days? Well, we called it the Carboniferous because most of the coal was formed at that time. But what was going on that allowed us to have giant dragonflies? Well, here's our timeline. CO2 concentration comes down. We have a big snowball Earth event. We come out of that snowball Earth event. Then we have another decrease in carbon dioxide associated with the Carboniferous. So much photosynthesis is taking place with this new life form, it draws down the carbon dioxide level. But it increases the oxygen level. So something strange is going on here. The carbon cycle that we talked about in a previous lecture seems to have gone out of kilter. CO2 is going down, oxygen's going up, and we would have thought if decomposition was taking place that the oxygen level would not have gone up but would have paralleled carbon dioxide. It didn't, so that all of the carbon which is being formed at this time didn't decompose, and instead oxygen levels rose. The consequence of that is that most of that carbon got buried. It got buried in a solid form of carbon instead of being released back into carbon dioxide. That's why it's known as the Carboniferous Period. The CO2 concentrations went down. Oxygen levels got to higher than they are today. We think they might have been 30% to 35%. The air was a little bit more dense, probably 25% higher pressure. And that higher pressure and the increased oxygen, we think, led to the evolution of flight. That it was easier for animals to develop flight and to fly in an atmosphere that was more dense, and certainly to have a higher rate of metabolism in an environment that had more oxygen. So during this Carboniferous period, there's a couple of take-home messages. First, we know from fossils that this was a time when giant lycophytes dominated. We know from fossils that it was a time when we found the first indications of flight and huge, gigantic dragonflies that we'll talk about in a future lecture. Oxygen levels decreased because of this photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide levels decreased. Oxygen levels increased. Total atmospheric pressure, as I mentioned, was higher than it is today. But the decomposition of these materials was low. The carbon cycle was altered from the cycle we first saw 2 lectures ago. So what was going on? Why didn't we have decomposition? So here's our group activity. We're going to talk about oxygen levels rising. What would be the impact of higher oxygen on fires? It's a topic relevant to the news today. What would have been the impact on animals? Why was there a disconnect in the carbon cycle? And why didn't microbes decompose all that dead plant biomass? As the carbon dioxide concentration was driven down, by the end of the Carboniferous, about 300 million years ago, the lycopod forest began to disappear. The earth was getting drier, carbon dioxide was getting lower. We were beginning to see the expansion of glaciers in the northern and southern latitudes because the carbon dioxide concentrations were low, and the Goldilocks planet was going from one in which there was no ice at either pole to an extensive abundances of ice at either of the 2 poles. This climate change impacted plant evolution. And what comes next in this evolutionary sequence will be the topic of the next lecture. But I think you can see here that the groups that next arose were the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. At the end of the Carboniferous, and in response to a decreased carbon dioxide environment. Today, we still find tree ferns, and we can still find horsetails, but they're nowhere near as large as they were 300 million years ago. Once again, here's a picture of Calamites, a fossil that I have in my office here at home, showing these giant horsetail-like plants from the Carboniferous that reached heights of 32 feet.